Hi, I'm Jeremy Engelman, and today we're going to talk about light fog. And that's it, just light fog. Light fog is an attempt to simulate all that particulate matter in the air, like dust and smoke and water vapor, very fine particulate matter in the air that gets illuminated by a light source. And it can be quirky to use, but yet it's also very versatile. There's a lot of things you can do with it that you may not immediately have thought of. So we have a lot to talk about, so let's take a look at it. We're going to start off today with this little dude and his flashlight. So I'd like to use this guy to talk about a very simple case in which you would use light fog. First of all, if I do a render of the scene, you will see that this little guy is standing in an environment where there is clearly some atmosphere. So there's some haze to this scene, and if there's all this particulate matter in this scene, then any of the other lights in the scene would be affecting this particulate matter, because that's what light fog is. Light fog is essentially the light bouncing around off very fine particulate matter. That's the simplest case in which you'd use light fog, and a real-world example of when you would put this light fog to use. So if there's all this particulate matter in this scene, this mist, this haze, whatever, all of these lights that this little guy is using, his flashlight here, the street lights here, these lights here, these would all be casting light fog out into the scene. And you can use light fog with point lights or with spotlights. So let's get some light fog at first. We'll start out with his flashlight. So in order to add light fog, you select a light, get the attribute editor up for that light. It's in the light effects folder, and you'll see the light fog attribute right here. And you just click to map that, and then you'll get the light fog shape here. And you will see that in the scene it also creates this cone shape, which you can also see in the outliner here. It'll create it under the spotlight, this cone shape. And this cone shape is going to be the extent of your light fog. So if I scale this cone shape back and I render this scene, we're going to see that the fog only extends out as far as that cone shape. So this is not what we want. So what you have to be sure to do is take that cone shape and scale it up big enough so that it either goes off screen or intersects objects that would occlude it. So here we can see it's intersecting the wall, and that should be big enough so that if we do another render of the scene, and you can adjust many of the light fog parameters in IPR, with the exception of scaling the cone shape. The first thing you should do is scale that shape, because while everything else updates in IPR, the scaling of the shape will not. You'll have to redo your IPR render if you scale the shape at all. So here we can see it coming in, and once this gets all updated, we can start tweaking our parameters. Pick a region, and then you'll see you have these parameters here, and intensity is clearly intensity, spread is how far it extends out, and we're going to talk about these a little more in depth. And then the light fog shape itself also has subparameters, the color, density, and then these two switches, which we are going to go over particularly. But again, for now, just to get this in here simply and to see what we've got. And that seems like something that might fit with this other atmosphere in this scene. Again, remembering that since light fog and any environment fog you might be using are the result of the same phenomenon, you kind of want to make them match, so that if we put this intensity up to 5, some crazy number, this light fog here and this environment fog don't seem to be coming from the same thing. They don't seem to be related at all. So what you want is you want to keep them in the same ballpark. The default of 1 was pretty good for this, and now we've got that. So the next thing to do then, if this light is able to cast this type of light fog, the other lights in your scene should darn better well be casting some light fog too. Otherwise that makes really no sense. A light fog is not the result of the light itself, it's a result of the particulate matter in the atmosphere. So you would want to go in and for these other lights also create a light fog. Again, remembering to scale the cone so that it intersects the ground here. And then once we get our cone scaled, we can do an IPR render and tune the other parameters of the light fog. So once this wakes up, we'll see that we'll be able to tune the spread and intensity to, again, better match the result of our flashlight light fog and the environment fog. And now that the IPR is coming in, you can see that I'd made a mistake. I didn't scale the cone all the way to where it should be scaled, so that I'm getting this line across here, which is clearly incorrect. So I'm going to bail out of that, close this, and rescale the cone. Don't do what I do as I say. So we make sure, again, that that cone is scaled all the way below the ground. And we do an IPR render. I just did that so that you'd see the result of your mistakes. So now you can see, now that I've done it correctly, I've got light fog going all the way and intersecting the ground. You can also see, as this is rendering here, you can also see that light fog will take on the color of the light as well. And again, we're going to talk about that more in detail, but for now you can see that there's a relationship between the light fog and the color of the light. So pick this region to tune, pick our light with the light fog, and we'll take down the spread and take down the intensity a bit. Might have been too much. And that seems about right. So then if we do a render of this scene and see the result, we'll see that our light fogs are intersecting the ground and intersecting the building in the correct way so that they fall off correctly so that you don't see the end of them, and we've got them to be in line with the environment fog which is in the scene, and they seem to be an effect of the exact same particulate matter in the air, which is how it would work in the actual world. So in order to really go through this, we'd also want to add it to these two lights, because these lights will be affecting that particulate matter in the same way as these, as well as this light coming off the window. But for now, we've done to these two lights, got them to hook up correctly with each other and with the environment fog. Now let's take a look at light fog on a point light. I mentioned that and showed that light fog works on spotlights, but it also works on point lights. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add light fog to this point light. Open the attribute editor for that light, the light effects folder, and then you map the light fog. And you'll see that instead of creating a cone shape, as it did with a spotlight, it's created a little sphere shape here for a point light, because it clearly is an omnidirectional kind of light, falls off in all directions. So, and whereas the spotlight had a spread control here, which controls how the fog falls off from the center out, the point light fog shape will have this fog radius control, which controls how large this sphere shape is, so that you can set where your fog falls off. And I'll set that so that it goes outside of our rendering region again, so that we can be sure that we don't get any of the harsh lines. So if I do an IPR render of this, we can start to tune our other parameters, because again, as I've said, once you get that sphere shape set, you can IPR render and tune everything else except for getting your light shape set. Now, light fog can take quite a while to update an IPR, so once you get your initial IPR region set, if you pick fairly small regions, it will update fairly quickly. But it is kind of heavy on the IPR, so you'll, again, once you get that initial IPR render done, you'll want to stick to small regions. So now we can see that light fog will also obey and will be related to the decay rate of your light. So I have this light set to linear. If I turn no decay off, my light clearly will get brighter all around, but also the light fog will become more intense all the way through the entire sphere shape. So typically with light fog, you will want to use a decay rate on your light, because fog typically, again, is much brighter when at the source of the illumination of the fog. So it'll be a lot more natural to use a decay rate with your light. So if I change that back to linear, we can see that it's much less intense now. If I change it to quadratic, I make the fall off even higher. You can see that the light, not only is the light decaying quite a bit quicker, but the fog itself will as well. So we'll switch it back to linear for now, which is generally the most manageable setting to use for your light fog's fall off. But you also have another control here for the fog's fall off. Normal is the default. Linear makes the fog fade off more slowly from the center of the light. And then exponential will make the fog fall off much more quickly from the center. If you're using a decay rate with your light, I usually stick with normal here, because if you're that way, the decay rate of the light and the decay rate of the fog are related. And then here we have the fog intensity control, which just controls the brightness of the fog. So as we've seen in the other scene, and this one as well, you can control the intensity of the fog. Make it ridiculously high, very subtle, or somewhere in between. And then if we do an actual render of the scene, we can see how the light fog is contributing to make this scene much more interesting. Now in this scene we have a little plane here, and let's take a look again at light fog in relation to spotlights. So if I go ahead and do an IPR render of this, I've already got fog assigned to it. I already have the light cones scaled so that they go off the screen, so you can see that we're not getting the harsh fog edge. I pick this region to tune, and the IPR is going much faster this time because we're not casting shadows with these fog lights. We are not casting shadows, and that is usually what will eat up most of the time and make your IPR renders go a lot slower. So they update very quickly if you're not casting shadows. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. Don't automatically assign shadows to, especially fog lights. They can really chunk your renders down. So if we pick one of these spotlights, we can see how, again, the same thing, the fog is going to obey the decay rate of your light as well as the intensity. And in here we have the light fog attributes. Again, a spread on a spotlight will control how quickly the light falls off from the edge to the center. So lower number will make it fall off more quickly. Higher number will go all the way to the edge of the light. So something like 0.5, you can get sort of a natural spread from this light fog. And again, intensity, same thing, controlling the fog intensity. But one thing to really look out for when you are using light fog is if you, I'm going to close the IPR render, is if you decide that this light here, you don't want fog on it anymore, so you break the connection, and then if you were to do a re-render, you'll see that now you're getting this very strange result here. It's almost like light fog, but it's perfectly crisp. Because if you open up the outliner, you don't see anything suspicious in here, but if you uncheck DAG objects only and check shapes, you'll see that the spotlight still has its cone shape attached to it, and we also have the light fog 2 shading group that was attached to this as well. So it doesn't automatically delete everything that needs to be deleted in order to actually get rid of it. So what you want to do is come under your spotlight here, delete the cone shape, and also delete the light fog that was attached to it. Now, if you do a re-render, it will be gone. And this can cause real trouble too if you then decide that, oh yeah, you do want light fog attached to it. If you were to leave those nodes in place, and only break the connection, but then decide you do want that, and so you map another light fog to it, you can get the same result again. It's not going to connect up in the correct way. So again, be sure that you delete the cone shape underneath your light and these new stray light fog nodes. Then when you go ahead and remap your light fog, you'll get the correct result. So deleting light fog is not as simple as just breaking the connection in the attribute editor of your light. You have to open the outliner and you have to uncheck DAG objects only and check shape nodes in order to be able to even see these nodes that you need to delete. So now I'm going to show you this little scene here with a spotlight. I'll IPR render this, and you will see that I've already got some light fog set up for this little spotlight. I've got the end of my cone scaled so that it goes out of frame and intersects with the ground so that we're not seeing the edge. And when I pick my region to tune, I am going to pick the light, get the attributes for that. I'm going to change the light color. And you should remember from the first scene that the fog does get affected by the light's color, so you can color the fog by changing the color of your light. Now, of course, you can also have a mapped light color, and the fog will respond to that as well. So that if I pick something like a fractal, now you can see I'm getting all of these rays coming out of the light. And these rays are coming from this texture is being projected 2D through the fog volume, so wherever it's black, I'll get nothing. Wherever it's not black, I'll get something. So you can change then the frequency of this to get, more or less rays coming through there. You can even adjust the color balance here so that you can have light color as well as streaks coming out of your light. And if we let the whole thing update, we can see that the light color also will affect, of course, anything getting lit by this light. Because you can also, in the light effects folder here, in your light fog attribute, you can also change the color of the fog itself. And these will work together. But this light fog color will only affect the color of the fog. It won't actually affect the illumination cast by the light. So that if you wanted to tweak your fog color, but that your light color was correct, you could use the fog color attribute. Now I'd like to show you one problem. I'm going to show you the problem, and then I'm going to show you how to fix it in a little bit. You're getting the streaks from the light fog volume when you are outside of the volume itself. But the minute you go into the volume, the minute the camera goes into the volume, we should see that we still see the fog. You can still see this green glow around the light, but the streaks are gone. We come back out of the fog and we see the streaks are back. So there is a workaround to this, and I'm going to show you that in a little bit. But for now, be aware that this light color, the streaks obtained from this light color, cannot be flown through. So if your camera flies through the fog, you're going to have to do this a slightly different way. Now we're going to talk about how objects within the fog volume get obscured. And namely, we're going to be talking about color-based transparency and fast drop-off. So we have this same spotlight here, same light fog volume, but this time we've got some cylinders in there. So what we're going to do is an IPR render of this scene, and pick my region to tune, and then look at these two attributes. Fast drop-off, when it's off, all objects within that fog volume are obscured by the same amount. If it's on, if fast drop-off is on, objects will be obscured by different amounts based on the density and the distance from the camera. So here, these cylinders within this fog volume with fast drop-off unchecked, they will get obscured by this density no matter how far away they are or how close they are. Now if we turn fast drop-off on, the objects that are closer will be obscured less than the objects further away. And typically you have to increase the densities or then decrease it back when you turn it off. But you can see that the fog volume is now the fall off of these objects as they get further away is now affected by both the density and the distance of those objects. And now color-based transparency, what that does, when it is on, objects are obscured based on the density and the color. The opacity of the fog is based on this color here and this density, so that if we have a color like white or something close to white, that fog will be fully opaque. But as soon as we turn that fog color to something like black or something very dark, the fog is no longer visible. But if we were to turn this off, now we're getting a visible fog with objects falling off into that fog. As well as a dark fog color. So if you have a dark fog color, you should be sure to uncheck this. Otherwise, the opacity of this fog will be based on both the density and the color. So this black being multiplied by the density equals 0, so it's not going to be visible at all. But if you turn that off, you can have black fog and still see it. So that's a rule of thumb. Dark fog, turn this off. Light fog, turn it on. So I mentioned earlier that the light rays that you get with color mapping a light don't respond the same way when you actually enter the fog volume. So you can see here, I render this scene, and we have this underwater scene here, some bubbles, a dolphin far away, you can barely see him, and we have these nice light rays. Now, these light rays are a result of a color-mapped spotlight with light fog on it. So this light color has a caustic sequence mapped to it, which creates both the dappled, the caustic pattern on the ground, as well as the light rays that you see entering the scene here. So now if I go to another camera view where I'm inside the fog volume here, and I do another render, you'll see that I'm no longer getting the light rays that I was getting before. And I mentioned that there is a way to work around that, and there is. I'm going to show it to you right now. What I'm going to do is open a different scene. And you can see it's a similar underwater scene, but what we have here, instead of a single light relying on the volume fog or the light fog and a color map applied to the light, rather than relying on that to create all of the rays, all of the light rays, the streaks that we see, we have here instead a whole bunch of spotlights, and each of these spotlights is then mapped to this projection here. So what we have a whole slew of spotlights, each color mapped to this projection, which has an image mapped to it, which is that same image sequence, the same caustic image sequence. And what that'll do is this projection will allow each light to project that image sequence through it, but so that we can have one image sequence applied to all of these lights. We're not getting a whole bunch of individual caustic patterns here, but rather the entire caustic pattern projected through those lights and then projecting down onto the surface of the ground surface down here. And each of these lights then has a light fog volume associated with it, so that we're getting the rays. If we do a render of this, we'll see that we have the caustic pattern on the ground project all as one pattern, again, as opposed to if we mapped each light's color with an image sequence, we would have that same image sequence appearing in little circles all over the ground, which is not what we want. We want the same sequence to be projected through all of these lights. So we create the texture as a projection, and then each one of these lights has a light fog attached to it, which creates its own streak. And this will allow you to fly through this fog. You can see that if we go to any frame this camera animates, we are now well within the fog volume here, and when we do a render, we're still getting all of the light ray streaks, whereas color mapping a single light fog light, once we enter the fog volume, we'll no longer get these rays. And let's have a look. I'm going to render the image sequence, fly through these light rays, and you will see that we're still getting the volume while flying through it. So now if we go out to F-check and check the results, light rays test, we can see that we are able to fly through our volume fog rays and we don't get any errors, as opposed to this render, which is the render of the light with its color mapped, and while we are outside of the fog volume, we're able to see the light rays. Once we enter it, we get this strange result. They go away, we get some flashes, and it's just generally ugly. So again, the way around this is to create multiple lights and projection map a texture through to them so that we get our nice consistent texture along the bottom that looks as though it's coming from one light, but each one of these lights has a fog volume associated with it so that we can then fly through these rays. So we have another scene here, and we want to add light fog to this scene because, well, it's this oasis kind of a thing, and oases are humid, I suppose, and so it would make sense to have light fog. There would be some humidity there, there would be this tendency for light to scatter within the light volume, so that's exactly when you want to use light fog. So let's add it to the scene. First of all, we'll add it to this light here, and first thing you want to do, of course, is map this light fog with, and you get your cone shape here. I'm going to make sure that this cone shape again is scaled so that it's intersecting and off the screen, which it is, and I want to add one to this light, which is a similar light as well. So I've got both my light fogs added. I make sure again, this same with this one, the edge of the cone goes all the way off the screen. And now we have these two lights. Now these two lights being similar lights, you would expect the light fog to behave similarly, kind of like optical effects where the two similar lights should share the same kind of optical effects. Two similar lights of similar intensities should share the same kind of light fog, because again, the fog is not a direct result of the light itself. It has something to do with the atmosphere scattering the light around. So similar lights will cast similar light fogs. So if I want to have these two lights link up and be similar, again, it's probably not a good idea to share light fog nodes, but what we'd rather do is connect them up via the connection editor. So in order to do that, take the outliner, we will make sure that we're showing everything, including not only the DAG object, so make sure that this is unchecked so that we can come down here and see our light fog nodes here. And then we will get the connection editor up, reload left off our first light fog, pick the second one, and reload right. And then we can go in and hook up things like the color, the density, and we can hook up these two options if you like. But mainly you want to hook up color and density. And we can close that. And now the light fog node from this light will be controlling the light fog node from this light. So that if we come to the light shape here and to our light fog 2 node, you can see that the density is controlled by something, and what it's controlled by is the light fog 1. So now that I have my cone shapes all in place, I can do an IPR render. And once that's updated, then of course pick my region, and I can change the first light fog attributes here, and they will both respond to that. And I can change the color, and they will both update. And remember that some of the attributes for controlling light fog are on the light itself, so you can do the same thing. Take the first spotlight, the shape node of the first spotlight, show the connection editor, reload left, and you need, in order to get the shape node to appear in the connection editor, which is where a light's intensity and the light fog attributes are, you need to display shapes in the outliner. And get the right ones hooked up. I think I picked the wrong thing. But once you get the correct ones hooked up, left and right, then you can go ahead and hook the things like the fog spread, intensity, and those will be linked and both update as well. Again, this is the best way to get your light fogs to respond similarly to each other. Sharing light fog nodes is problematic. Additionally, many of the things that you control your light fog, several of the attributes here are in the actual light itself. So again, hooking them up through the connection editor is the best way to go about that. So I'll rein that back a little bit. And I'm going to close this IPR file because I also want to add light fog to our caustic casting light down here at the very bottom of the scene where there's supposed to be some water down here. This light right now has its color mapped, and it's projecting a caustic map up through here to give the illusion that there's some water down here in the bottom of this courtyard. So these lights being able to affect the humidity in the air and produce light fog, this light would again do the same thing. As if there's humidity in the air, all the lights around it will be affected by it and appear to cast light fog. So we want to add light fog to this light as well. And I have to close the IPR window because I don't have the light fog added, and so the cone shape is not updated, which is the reason that IPR doesn't update, because it's geometry dependent. That cone shape is a change in geometry, and IPR can't update that. So that's the reason for creating your light fog and getting the cone shape set to the right size, making sure that it's, again, outside of frame before you do an IPR render. Because now, if I do the IPR render of this scene, I can tune the attributes to this light fog. And I don't want too much light fog, so the defaults are going to be huge on this, because this is reflected light coming off of this thing, so it's not really going to need a huge amount of projected fog. It's not supposed to be that bright, so the defaults of 1, I'm sure, are going to be too bright right off the bat. So as it IPRs, you can see I'm getting now light fog now coming from the projected caustic map. And I'll pick an area here. And I'm just going to drop this down quite a bit. And make sure that it's not affecting too much these upper regions here. Again, it does obey this linear decay rate that I've set for the light, so it will fall off as it gets further from the source, but just in making sure that the effect is nice and subtle, because this being reflected light, it's not going to cause that much effect on the light fog itself. On the humidity in the air, this light fog should be pretty subtle. So now that I've got that, a little bit of light fog on that, see how easy it is to add light fog? It's a piece of cake. So I will render out the sequence of this, and we will take a look at what that looks like. So now the sequence is done rendering. If we have a look at it, F-check, open the animation. What did I call it? I called it water. Water, yes. Let's get rid of that. You can see that I've got my light fogs here, and the water caustics, the reflected light off of the imaginary water surface is down here, is also casting light fog into the scene, and the effect is subtle, but it is convincing. Again, this light fog is, we want to keep it subtle because the reflection of that off of that water surface is not necessarily going to be that bright, casting these rays of fog into the, so you just want to be careful with that. But about this amount, and is looking good. So what about a scene like this? I've got this spotlight here. I want to illuminate this big orb in the air, and this spotlight has got this large surface from which it's going to be illuminating. What do we do for that? Well, if I go ahead and I create a light, a spotlight, look through that, and then position it so that it lines up here to act as though it's coming through this light, you can see that this light is well behind this object, which is supposed to be the light. So the first thing that you want to do, of course, is pick this object, pick this light, and break light link so that this light is not actually illuminating just the back side of this object, because otherwise we're just going to hit this object and cast a shadow just illuminating the back, which is not what we want. So first thing to do would be to unlink this light from the object. But if now we take this light and we create a light fog for it, and then we scale that volume, so that it again goes off the screen, and I'm going to come in a little bit so that it more closely matches the glass in here, which is casting the light. Maybe in a little bit more. And then I do a render. Well, what's happening? Obviously, the light fog is emanating from this point here, but we want the fog to be only coming from here. How do you get around this? Well, the answer is in the decay regions of this spotlight. It's in the light effects folder, and there's another one called decay regions. And use decay regions. Turn that on, and then you can set them numerically here, these decay regions, but it's more useful to edit them visually. So if you display camera light manipulator decay regions, you'll get these decay regions here. And what does this do? Well, it essentially creates distinct areas of illumination for this light. So now you can see we've got these very particular fog volumes here. And these correspond to the decay regions. The light will illuminate only within this region, and so the fog will show up only within this region. So what we can then do is we can move all of these out. Move this one back. And then set your second decay region to begin within the light fixture here. And then when we render that, you can see that the the light fog doesn't begin at the actual source of the spotlight. It is obeying these decay regions here, and so our light now appears as though it's beginning with this large area here and goes out from there. So you might think, well, that's all fine and great, Jeremy, but what about shadows being cast by that light fog? Does that work? Yes, it does, is the quick answer. However, it doesn't obey ray trace shadows. So adding shadows to light fog is simple. All you have to do is turn on shadows for the light that has the light fog assigned to it. We can see light fog with our light there. I just turn on shadows here. The hitch is, of course, that it only obeys depth map shadows. It does not obey ray trace shadows. So for doing things like transparency, a transparency mapped object, you're going to have the same problems as you will with depth map shadows. The light fog is not going to work with a transparency mapped object because depth map shadows don't work with a transparency mapped object. So you'd have to be aware of those limitations, and there are ways around it, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But again, since it only obeys depth map shadows, it has the same limitations as depth map shadows themselves. So now I've enabled shadows here. I'll just do an IPR render. And we can see that now this sphere is casting shadows from this light fog. So I'm going to pick a region. I'm going to tune this just a little bit. I'm going to pull down this fog spread so that the edges are not quite so harsh on this thing. I'm going to change the color a little bit because I'm going to be adding another light fog to the scene. I want to be able to tell them apart a little bit. So something that could be believable but yet different other than white. And then I'll pull density back just a little bit. So you can see now we've got light fog casting shadows. Now light fog is great for simulating all of that fine, very fine particulate matter in the air that light could potentially illuminate to create this fog, like humidity or very fine dust, powder, smoke, that kind of thing. But what about larger particulate matter that you would find around? Stuff like just larger dust bits or larger smoke, dust, that kind of thing. What do you do about that? Well, you could create a particle system in here and have that light illuminate the particles, but then you would have the added overhead of managing a particle system, managing everything that goes with a particle system, and you might not have the amount of control that you want. So what do you do about that? Well, that is where mapping the density of this light fog comes in. Density, just how dense this stuff is. You can map it. So if I close this and I create a new spotlight and look through it, and I place it roughly where the other one is, and again, I'm not duplicating it because there's a whole host of problems coming from duplicating lights with light fog. You can do it, but you have to be sure that everything's hooked up right. Usually it's just easier to create a new light. So I come back roughly in the same place. I'm going to leave this light selected. I'm going to pick the light rig, and I'm going to head and break the light link so that, again, same as the other light fog light, this light is not illuminating this geometry. And I'll grab this light and add light fog. Scale the cone shape till it goes just off screen. And now we're ready to IPR render this thing. And we've got the same problem here of this light fog starting at the very perfect, precise, infinitesimally small cone point at the start of it, which we want to fix. So I'll pick my second light here, and I'll enable these decay regions and set both of the first two and the third one I'll set to 5, I believe is where the start was. And the end distance here I can either set with this slider here, or I can display camera light manipulator decay regions, and I can manipulate it that way. Till it goes off screen. And now we have our light behaving in the same way as our original one. So this second light, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the light fog node, and I'm going to map the density. I'm going to map it to granite. And I'll change these to black and white. And now you can see that we've got the beginnings of a heavier, a larger particulate matter in our light cone here. So I'll increase the size a little bit. And I don't want quite so many in there. And then I'm going to change how bright and dark they get. This spottiness attribute is great. It'll allow you to, some of them will be very bright, and some of them will be a little darker. And there you have it. It's simple. So you can get this effect of a very small scale particulate matter, some humidity, and then a larger scale particulate matter, some kind of dust. And we're using 2 light fog volumes to do that, and one of them with its density mapped to a granite. So there's another little devil that reared its head during the scene. It has to do with how objects in light volumes get occluded by that fog. Now, this object here, you might think, in looking at the scene, you might think that the dark side of this object is just too dark, and it does seem to be that way. And there are 2 reasons. First reason is that there's something funky with the renderer. If you take the fog spread up, you can see this object starts to seem as though it were more occluded, more behind, more within this light fog volume. So when you're using a low fog spread, that's when you can kind of get the feeling like this object is pasted on here. And the other reason is simply because something the renderer can't do is this fog volume, once all these little particles are illuminated, all of that fog bounces, or all of that light, bounces around within this fog, and the fog itself becomes a light source. So the fog itself would illuminate the backside of this sphere, and that's just something that the renderers just can't do yet anyway. So part of it is something kind of funky with the renderer, which is when you have a low fog spread value, And some of it is just something that the renderer can't do, which is bounce light off all of these individual particles and act as a light source itself. So how do you get around that? First way would be to create an ambient light. And I know you should never create ambient lights. We always say no to ambient lights. But in this case, an ambient light can save your tush. But you don't want this ambient light illuminating anything else. We're going to exclusively link it to this sphere. So we pick the ambient light. We select objects illuminated by the light. Pick the ambient light again and break the light links. And then pick the ambient light and pick the sphere, and then we make light links. And now we can use this ambient light to make it seem as though it is behind this fog volume. The sphere, excuse me, is behind the fog, not the ambient light, that's not behind the fog volume, but the sphere is behind the fog volume. So now we have some additional light fog in front of this sphere. Again, without the ambient light, it seems to be pasted on. And the other way to get around this is by rendering two fog passes out and then compositing those. And for a still, you can composite with Photoshop. For an animation, you'd use a compositor like After Effects or Shake or anything else. But in this case, we will use Photoshop because this is still, works fine. So I'll take away the ambient light. And for the first pass of this render, I will render the entire scene. And I'll save that. And then for the next pass, I'm going to want to render just the fog. So I'll hide all those other objects. And render only the fog. And you can see now I've got a fog alpha channel here. So I'll use that to composite this fog over the other fog so that that sphere seems sandwiched in between those two layers of fog. I'm going to come out here to Photoshop, and I have my other secondary fog layer here, already brought in with an alpha channel. And then I would just line these up to be correct. So then you can see now we're getting some fog in front of this object as well, and it doesn't look quite so pasted on. So now we have this seemingly innocuous scene, a couple of walls, a couple of lights, and that's it. But what we're going to create is we're going to create a cool teleportation effect. And this scene's going to get heavy because we're going to animate a bunch of the parameters associated with light fog. So if we look at what we've got so far, we have 2 point lights here, which is what we're concerned with. This point light has an animated intensity, but it also has an optical effects node associated with it, and which you should be familiar with from rendering 3. So we are not going to go over this optical effect node, but this light and this light are going to work together, both providing some intensity, this light providing the optical effects flare, and this light providing the light fog. So this is the one that we're concerned with. So this light already has a light fog bound to it, associated with it. So all we have to do is come in here and see what we've got so far. If we come to the beginning of the scene and take a quick render of it, we've got our light fog was there, we have some dim illumination in the scene, and we have our optical effect. We come out to the middle, same thing, and at the end it's fading out, but our light fog is still there. So what we want to do is get this to go along with the other light. So the first thing to animate is going to be this fog intensity. So I'm going to come out here to frame 1, set a fog intensity of 0, and set a key. All of these parameters can have keys set for them. I'm going to come out here to 20 or so, 0.3 of fog intensity, set another key, frame 55, set a key, and set a couple more, and then at frame 90 I'm going to set it to nothing. So now you can see when we re-render frame 90 that we've got the fog going away, and at 55 the intensity is growing. So now it corresponds to our other light a little bit better. And the next thing to animate will be the fog radius, because we want this fog to grow over time. So I'll come back out to frame 1. The radius should be 0 at frame 1. Set a key, and I'll just come out to frame 90. Make the radius 15, which goes almost all the way to the edges. Set another key, and the reason being that we want this fog to seem as though it's going to disperse. So since our fog intensity goes to 0, it's going to fade to nothingness but continue to grow, so it seems as though it's dispersing over time. If we render a frame later on in the sequence, we can see how that's going to work. And I also want to animate the intensity of the light cast by this light fog. So I'll come back out to frame 1. Again, at frame 1, I'm going to make it 0. At frame 10 or so, 15, I'm going to make the intensity 30, because I have a linear decay rate. And at frame 90, drop off to 0. So now we can see over time our fog radius increasing and our intensity going up, then back down again. Now the next thing to animate will be the density of the light fog itself, because if we render this, we'll see that we've still got this perfect sphere of a light fog. And we want to mix it up a little bit. So we go to the light fog node, and the density here can be animated. But what I want to do is animate a fractal attached to it, so we have a little noise in there. So I'm going to attach a solid fractal to it, and I keep the defaults, but I'll check animated, and I'm going to create an expression on time. So solid fractal time equals time divided by 200. Now, when we render out here, we've got this fractal pattern. We've mixed it up a little bit, and it's not this perfect sphere. And then having the time parameter animated is going to ensure that it phases over time, that it doesn't stay static, that we have some nice secondary motion through there. And the last thing to animate, we want to give this light fog some color. So I'm going to attach a file to this point light with the fog, but I'm not just going to attach a file, I'm going to attach an animated sequence. So you can get some really cool results by attaching an animated sequence to the color of this light fog light. So I'll pick a file, and I'm going to use this sequence here, which would provide a really cool effect for the light fog. I use frame extension, and I'll create a new expression on a frame extension. So it'll be file 5 frame extension, copy that out, paste it in here, equals frame. Create it, close. Now when we update our time slider here, you see the frame extension updates and loads the right sequence, the right image from the sequence. So now if we come out here somewhere in the middle of the sequence and render it, we'll see that we're getting some really cool results. Not only do we have the color animated, hooked to an animated sequence with some color in it and some variation in the color and intensity of the light. We also have the intensity animated. It goes up and then back down again. We also have the density of the light fog animated so that it's hooked to a fractal, so that you get this phase in and out of the fractals. It doesn't look static. And we have the radius animated of the light fog so that it moves up, and then as the intensity goes back down, radius continues to move up and looks as though this fog is dispersing. And we have the intensity animated, which again brings down the fog intensity so that it fades out over time. So you can see you can animate any of these parameters. We're going to render out the sequence and take a look at that. And so now if we go out to fcheck and have a look at the sequence, you can see that we've got all of these things working together to create this great effect where the light color is mapped, the light fog is mapped, it's all animated, the radiuses are animated, and you special if ordinarily you might think you might have to do with particles or something complex, but we're just doing it with lights, and light renders very quickly. You can tune it very easily under IPR, which you can't necessarily do with a particle effect, and so it can be very quick, easy, economical. Some really cool effects like. Remember that I mentioned that light fog can cast shadows, but can only cast depth map shadows. So you might, when the heck can you get depth map shadows to work in this scene, thereby getting the light fog to actually obey the shadows? A wall, it's just a flat plane, but it has a transparency map texture on it, so it looks like there's a hole in it. And you should remember that depth map shadows cannot cast shadows through a transparency mapped object, whereas ray trace shadows can. But in this case we need depth map shadows to cast shadows through it so that we can get the light fog to work. So it's a little bit of a process, but it's possible. So what we're going to need to do is get the outliner. I've already separated out this front NURBS cube plane. That's going to be the one we're going to focus on for right now. I'll get the multi-lister up so that we can create a dummy material. We're going to create a dummy material, say a Lambert, just for now. We don't need a blend material for this. And we are going to assign it to the NURBS cube for now. This is the old material here where you can see the color is mapped and the transparency is mapped. So we'll remember that this is the original material, but for now we've assigned this dummy material here. Then what we want to do is duplicate the transparency map. So we have a new map here, and I'm going to turn off invert so that we can use this correctly, because what we're going to do is we're going to map this to the displacement of this material. So we get this shading group for it, and we drag this over. And the reason that we had to uninvert it is because right now it's mapping transparency. So where it's white, it's opaque. But when we displace it, we want displacement is going to be white, it's going to get displaced. So we want it to be white here, because we're going to displace this out and delete the polygons that get displaced. So we're also going to up the alpha gain, something like 6, so that we can get those polygons further away. And I'll show you this in a second. So what we now have this assigned to our NURBS plane here, the front of the cube. And then what we do is we go to Modify, Convert, Displacement to Polygons. And you'll see you get this very rough displacement, but you can kind of see what we're going to do. We're going to displace this out so we can delete the polygons here where it would be transparent. But what we need to do is we need to get that to be a little bit finer of a displacement. So I'm going to pick that NURBS cube again. I'll turn on shaded mode in the perspective view, the attribute editor up for that NURBS cube, and in the tessellation attributes, I'm going to click Display Render Tessellation, and you can see it's really rough here. And I'm going to enable Advanced Tessellation, and then I'm going to change the number, I'm going to up the number of spans here, the number of times it tessellates this so that we have a finer tessellation. That should do it, because when you convert displacement to polys, it will take into account the tessellation values that you set in the shape node of the object. So again, I'll try this again, convert displacement to polygons, and now you'll see in this view here we have this object displaced out in the same places where our original NURBS surface is transparency mapped. And you can see that it creates a duplicate of it, so we don't have to worry about duplicating the original object. You can if you want, if you have some assignment you need to keep, or to keep it cleaner, you can duplicate this, but when you convert it to polys, it won't destroy the original surface. It creates a duplicate surface, leaves the original there. So we'll just have to remember to go back to the multi-lister and reassign the original material to our NURBS surface here. Then when we pick this surface, we'll pick face, and then we can just delete all of these faces along here that we've displaced. And that's the reason for increasing the alpha gain on the new file that you created. You increase the alpha gain, you'll be increasing the amount that you displace. And we only do that to make it easier to select these polygons in order to delete them. So we can come in and, clean up some of these that we missed. But it doesn't have to be precise because you're only going to use this object as a shadow casting object. So once you get it somewhat cleaned up, you can see now this new object here has a big hole exactly where our transparency mapped object has got one. So now if I pick this again, I'm going to go to the attribute editor and I'm going to turn off primary visibility. And then for the original surface, the transparency mapped surface, I'll also go to the render stats and turn off cast shadows. Close this, and that way, when I render it now, I will get the original transparency mapped NURBS surface and the new poly surface, which only casts shadows, which creates our volume fog shadows, our depth map shadows, and this is the way in which you go about creating light volume shadows with transparency mapped objects. Now I've done that same thing with this scene here. So if we get the outliner up, you can see I have this original polygonal skull, and if we get the multi-lister up, you can see that I've mapped that with a transparency map so that it would appear to have these holes in it. And I've got a light coming from within, but again the problem was casting these shadows or the volume lights out of the transparency mapped skull. So what I did the same thing as before. I created a displacement map based on my same transparency map, displaced that skull out, and then went around and deleted, you can see here, all of the areas that were displaced out, so that now I have actual holes in this particular object. You can see them there and there. And then, of course, I set that up as a shadow casting object without primary visibility and turned off shadow casting for the transparency mapped object. So that the result is rendering as we speak. And the result is this. So we have super cool light coming from within this bullet-riddled skull or whatever it is. With these transparency maps on, we have the volume lights coming out, casting shadows, accurate shadows where the holes are. But what I want to really talk about in this scene is the notion of volume sample overrides, which, if you can see, it may look smooth on your TV monitor, actually, your television, but what we have in this scene, if I zoom in, you can hopefully see it. You can see we've got a lot of aliasing going on, a lot of stepping the number of samples is too low. It's not giving a smooth result in the shadowed fog. So we need to be able to get around that. And the way that we do that is through what's called the volume samples override. So you pick your light, which is casting your fog, and you go to the shape node of the light fog itself. So if we display shapes here, you see whenever you should know that whenever you create a light with light fog, you get a sphere shape or a cone shape if it's a spotlight. So you go to the sphere shape here, and you'll see this checkbox here, volume samples override. And you check that, and then you change this number. Now, there's no particular hard and fast rules of what to change this number to. You just have to change it to the lowest possible number that gives you a smooth result. So it can be something, it could be 2, it could be 4, it might even be 150 if you're going through some fog. It may be really high. You just have to find the sweet spot, the lowest number that creates a smooth, acceptable result. So in this case, I think I'm getting a pretty smooth result with 4. And I can turn on depth jitter as well. And what that will do, it will randomize the samples within that volume. So it will reduce a banding artifact. Sometimes, it's not too bad in this one, but you'll see distinct bands of where the samples are being taken from. Don't confuse that with the light rays being cast out of that thing. That's not them. But you may or may not turn this off, depending on if you're getting banding artifacts through here. But I'm going to turn it on for this example, and I'll do a re-render. And it will take longer to render. Obviously, anytime you increase the samples of anything in computer graphics, you're going to be increasing your render time. So managing, don't just arbitrarily set it high and just hope for the best. If you're rendering a whole sequence of frames, you could shave off minutes off of each frame, which could really add up. So do some testing early on, make sure you get a satisfactory result, and then render your frames. Don't be tempted to just set it to some high number. You know, it'll pay off in the end to do a little experimenting on this. You can see already how much longer it's taking just increasing it to 4. So you can imagine if I had to increase that thing to 32 or 60 or 100 or whatever. And as it's coming in here, you can kind of see that it's much smoother. I still actually do have some artifacts here, but I think the result is acceptable. So if I were rendering the scene out, I would leave it at 4. You'll also notice, you should notice, that turning this option on, I've noticed that it a lot of times can change the character of your fog itself in kind of an unexpected way. I wouldn't expect it to behave that way all the time, but even just turning it on, upping the samples, a lot of times your fog will come out dimmer, as mine has. So you may have to go back in and increase your light fog intensity once you turn on the volume samples override. In this case, I would, because my original really bright light fog coming through here has gotten a lot dimmer just by turning that on. So what I would normally do for this is come in and increase my fog intensity, which should take care of some of that. So now you can see I'm getting my original fog intensity back. I'm getting a nice smooth result in the fog, and I am cheating volume fog and depth map shadow casting. And I'm going to make this picture into a velvet poster, which will be for sale. Another way, and possibly a better way, to deal with the issue of light fog aliasing is to increase the fog shadow samples. Now, this is our original render where we can see we've got this graininess. Our volume samples override is not selected, so we're getting the default. We come back to the point light shape, and in the depth map shadow attributes is this number called fog shadow samples. And if you increase this number, and we'll pick a region to render, you can get a smoother fog result. But we're still not all the way there. This number can end up getting really high. Like even if I double it to 80, and re-render the region, we're getting in the ballpark. Still a little grainy, so sometimes you have to crank this number to over 100 to get a decent result. But the advantage to this method is that unlike the volume samples override, it doesn't seem to affect the intensity of the fog. However, this can have some problems if you have small objects casting shadows from these volume samples. So it would be better to start with this, and if you can't get this to look right, then to go to the volume samples override. As you can see here, we're getting a nice smooth fog result from a number like 100, the default being 20, producing this result here. Now in this scene I want to talk about volume lights and how those relate and how those work with light fog. So I have a little scene with a fish here, deep sea guy, and he's got one of these little glowy things that illuminates fish, lures fish in, and he eats them. So we need this. It's already got a light glow on it, but we need it to actually illuminate around it. So a volume light will be perfect for this. And what a volume light is, we create lights, volume light, and move it up towards here. And we'll get a point volume light by default. And I'm going to select this little glow stalk here and break the light lengths for it so that this light does not affect it. Make sure it's in there, it's positioned correctly. And then I'm going to scale it, because you see that when you create a volume light, if you create a point light, you get this sphere shape by default. You should be familiar with the sphere shape. It's the same kind of thing as light fog uses. And so if you create a spotlight, which is the other kind of volume light you can create, it will create a cone shape. This sphere shape will allow you to precisely control where this light envelops. This light will only exist within this sphere shape. So it can be really handy to use it with light fog. So I'm going to get the attribute editor up for that, change the intensity a bit, and I'll IPR render this. And you can see we're getting his little fish face illuminated there a little. And what's cool about the volume light is that instead of, you'll notice there's no light decay setting, because you are explicitly controlling the light decay with this color range sliders here. So you can control how quickly it falls off by moving these little ramps around. And you can even make the fall off do some kooky thing, like go in and out. You're getting dark here, light here, dark here, corresponding to these. So it gives you precise control over where your light goes in this volume. And that's a great thing for using with light fog. Now if I create light fog here, the light fog shape will be by default the same shape as this, and generally that's a good idea. You can run into problems if you scale the light fog shape smaller than the area it's illuminating. You'll get it clipped. So it's a good idea to keep it the same shape. So now if I IPR render this, I'll be getting light fog and the volume light both, and the light fog existing in the same space as the volume light. And if I go in and bring down that light fog intensity, we can get something that's not quite so blown out. But the cool thing now is that, again, if I take this color range ramp here and start playing around with it, I can do some particularly interesting things. I can create these ringing effects. And have it fade off, then come back on again, and the light fog is perfectly happy to obey all of this. So I can create these rings. Again, if I have cones, I can explicitly control what kind of fall off I'm getting. So this is really handy for dealing with light fog. So you can get some really interesting effects very simply, and you haven't had to change the light fog density or color or map the light's color. You've already got a ramp control for that. Another thing you can do with light fog is you can map the density of that light fog to a projection and a ramp. So in this way you can create a layered kind of a fog, one that you sometimes may create with an environment fog, but if you want to keep it local and you want to have more control and you want that fog to, if you just want to have more control over your fog and you want all the other controls available to you with light fog that aren't available with environment fog, you can do it this way. So in this scene I've got kind of a table with some stuff on it, but I want to have some kind of mist on the table or whatnot. So what I'm going to do is create a spotlight, and I'll move it just above the scene here. The attributes for that. And I'm also going to turn off illuminates by default, because I'm happy with the lighting that's in this scene. I just want to add some fog. So this is another thing you can do with light fog, is if you turn off illuminates by default, the light itself won't actually illuminate anything. You'll only be using that light for fog. So it'll be a fog only light. So the light effects roll out here. I'll map light fog, and again, once I get my shape scaled correctly, and my cone angle to what I want it, then I will attribute editor back up, go into light fog node, and I'm going to map the density. Typically when you map something with a 2D texture, normal will be selected here, and if you mapped a ramp to it, you would get a ramp going across the density. But in this case we want to map it as a projection. And create that ramp. Now close this, and you'll see now we have this place texture node, which we can move into place here. And then scale it up so that it covers the light. The entire cone of the volume of the light. And once we do that, now this ramp will control directly the density of this light. So we know exactly where that fog is going to show up. I have the ramp here. I'm going to go ahead and change each of these to black and white. I'll move that down. I'm going to add another black one here. So now I will have a layer of fog that I can control exactly where it shows up, and then the fall off along each, above it and below it. So now that I have that, I can IPR render this scene. And I can start to pull in where the fog will end up. I'm going to increase the fog intensity so we can see it a little bit better. I'll make this one white. And then you can see I can have precise control over where I'm bringing in this light fog. I know exactly where it's going to show up. And I can even change the interpolation so it's smoother or exponential, or whatever I want. So once I'm happy with where it's coming in, I can then even map this color here to something like a solid fractal, and then I can perturb that line just a little bit so it's got some irregularity to it. Changing the frequency, make it bigger, smaller. You can see the irregularity in there. Make it look a little more natural, not this perfect line. Let the whole thing update. And now we have a way in which to control a layered kind of fog. You can have precise control over where you want it to go without using environment fog, and you get all the benefits of all of the other things that we've discussed with using light fog. Now, the last thing that I want to impress upon you is that by mapping the density of your light fog, you can get some really stunning effects. So I'm going to go ahead, I have a scene here, I'm going to IPR render this scene. I want to see it come in. We've got a field, some posts, volume fog coming in from the back. There's in fact a couple layers of volume fog working in this scene. There's the one from up here, creating this overall kind of sky fog, and there's one down here in the back, creating this kind of backlit illumination here. So I'm going to pick a region to tune for now, just this top region. And I'll pick the light that is creating this volume light fog here. Attribute editor for that. I've already, of course, got the light fog on. I've got the spread and intensity to where I like them. I've got something, I've got a ramp map to the color, give a little variation. So the only thing left to do on this is to map the density, because of course we're getting this even volume, even illumination. So what you want to do when mapping the density of a light fog is you usually want to use 3D texture, because then it will map the density of that fog in 3D space, so you can get some really nice volume, or some real volume going on. So you want to use typically 3D textures for this. So try any of these out, and stucco, you can try that one. Now you can see we're getting red and blue here. That doesn't really matter, because what we're really in fact actually getting is only the luminance of that red and blue. Since the density is a single number, a single float number, it will look at the luminance of this red and blue. So it's alright if you have this color here. Don't get it confused. It won't actually give you color. Mapping the density will only affect the actual density of the thing, not color. So it's fine if we have this red and blue. So that being said, what you can do is you can start to layer these things to build up some really interesting effects by mapping the alpha gain. And you want to map the alpha gain because, as I've said, the density is a float value, single number value. So what we're interested in here is mapping the alpha gain. So we map that, and we map the alpha gain with something like a marble, and we start to get layers of this stuff happening. Several layers of stuff working in there. Once that updates, now I can adjust these parameters, pull some of these down so that it's not so harsh there. Again, any of these parameters, they update so quickly that it's just great to go in and play, but you can get some really nice volume effects here. You know, I love the way this is happening here, the way this is, seems like there's this mist coming up, rising up off this surface here. It looks really nice. So you go back out to the density and break that. Right when I get something I like, of course. First thing I do, go out and break it. And map it again. Again, it updates so quickly. And so if we map this with something like this solid fractal, which is really, this solid fractal is really versatile. You have all kinds of settings for this. This is one that will give you some nice general noise in there, bigger, smaller, what have you. But then again, here we come down to the alpha gain, and we can map this with something like, if we map it with this rock texture here, we can start to get, again, some really interesting stuff going on. Some stuff you might think would be difficult to get or really expensive, but in fact it's not. It's so cheap. You can see how quickly IPR updates it. Come out, break it again, remap it with Brownian, whatever. This is a really useful one, and again another kind of noise. But the power of these noises are not just the noise themselves, because you see how regular this thing is, and it looks computer generated and whatnot, but the power of it really is when you start to combine them. You start to combine several of them together. So you can get some really interesting things happen. You combine several of these procedural textures and you get something that doesn't necessarily look procedural. So we map the alpha again with whatever, some leather, and we'll pull down the cell size. You can see that leather alpha gain coming in. Something very regular there. Definitely have some use for something like that. But now we've got just some interesting stuff happening. You might even think you could only get this effect by using particles, but no. If you need something in the background like this happening, you can do it with light fog. And I want to show one more noise, which is this volume noise, which is about the most versatile one because you have the ability to set several types, several different noise functions. And they all have their uses, but billow is great. It's really good. Billow is in fact how I made this terrain. I made this terrain by using billow as a displacement map over it and converting that to polygons, and then remapping that billow back down with the color map to it so it gets darker in the crevices and it lets my bitmap here show through. So again, I use billow as a displacement map, and I got a pretty interesting terrain with that, this kind of muddy looking stuff. And then you can pick your fall off types, and this bubble is really interesting. You can get some really interesting effects with it. And then again, mapping the alpha gain. And you're getting this. You can map the alpha gain again. And then you can see how even using procedural textures, you can get some shapes that are not all that procedural looking. Some shapes that actually have some naturalness to them. So I'll map this back. I think this was my favorite. I like how this looks like some steam coming off this murky bog here. And there you have that. Light fog with the density mapped, and then that density, the alpha gain, mapped. You can really build up some interesting layers going on with this. So what I'm going to do now is I've got a character in here, and now that I've got my background all set and all rendering the way I want it, I'll go ahead and do an actual render of this. And that's that. I hope you learned how to effectively use light fog, and I hope that you've seen how you can really use it to make your scenes great, and I hope you have fun with it.
We hope this DVD is helped you learn more about Maya, and we appreciate your support. Visit the NormanWorkshop.com or visit Norman3D.com. For training, visit Norman Online. DVDs by Dave Picciuto, Simon and Al.